Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Mass Effect Andromeda single player. I lied. I said I was here to ask and answer a simple question. Mass Effect Andromeda is not a simple question. It's been the talk of the town over the last few weeks, and probably for the reasons that EA really wasn't hoping for. Developed by BioWare, and by BioWare I actually mean BioWare Montreal, a support studio. This is a game that has courted a ton of controversy over the last few weeks, related to a fairly wide variety of different things. As a result of it being in such focus, under such a spotlight, the coverage of it has been, I think, irrevocably tainted as a result of the huge amount of online noise surrounding this game. It's very difficult to talk about video games in a vacuum when it comes to consumer criticism. I try to do it as much as possible, as far as I'm aware, do most game reviewers. And even then, it's quite tricky. You may have a conversation with one of your colleagues, and an opinion of theirs might end up in a video of yours, or perhaps may influence your opinion in such a way that you either agree with them or disagree with them. You may be nudged in one direction or the other. You may have your perception of the game tainted or colored, whichever you prefer. I think tainted perhaps is a word that is tied into the idea of negativity, and I don't think this is necessarily a negative thing, by maybe streaming the game prior to launch and seeing what the audience has to say. But when it comes to a game like Mass Effect Andromeda, when the conversation has been loud, widespread, and constant over the last few weeks, I think it is, without a doubt, impossible to go into a game like this without some sort of preconception. It's also impossible to go in and maintain, I think, a solid level of balance when it comes to your critique. There are too many temptations, both overt and perhaps subconscious. You may very well overtly decide to be contrarian, since there is so much negativity around this game. You may decide that the game needs a more positive look. That may be the way that you distinguish your review or video from everybody else's. That in itself is perhaps inherently dishonest, but then there's all of this unconscious bias. Things that you don't realize. It's very difficult to avoid that sort of thing. And as a result, especially with the unique circumstances of Mass Effect Andromeda, the sort of partial embargo that was in place that allowed impressions of the first 5 hours to come out, and then, of course, the 10-hour trial that was brought out through Origin Access, followed by the full lifting of the review and streaming embargo. It's a very strange and unique situation, and a fairly strange and unique set of circumstances for this game to exist within, and for this video to exist within as well. I'm going to try my best. What can I say? But I'm not going to lie, it's entirely possible that all of this kerfuffle over the last few weeks has pushed me in one direction or another. That actually kind of sucks. It makes you question yourself. It makes you second-guess your opinion, as well as the way that you present it. Alright, Mass Effect Andromeda is not a sequel to Mass Effect in the sense that it does not continue the trilogy. The trilogy is over, Shepard as a character is done, and this game takes place in an entirely new galaxy, and it also takes place before the events of Mass Effect 3. So the whole Reaper invasion, all that sort of thing, these guys don't know anything about it. And all of those really important and earth-shattering events within the third game, they really have no influence over this whatsoever. Which is, in some ways, a good thing, considering the way that Mass Effect 3 ended was not satisfactory to a lot of people. I never played Mass Effect 3, at least outside of the multiplayer beta. I was actually part of a boycott. I boycotted it on the basis that I felt that withholding the Prothean squad mate as Day 1 premium DLC was an extremely poor business practice. It was anti-consumer, and it was, and I hesitate to use the phrase, but maybe this is one of the few instances in which it would be applicable, a slap in the face to long-term fans of the series. The Protheans being one of the biggest story elements of the whole Mass Effect trilogy, having an actual living Prothean be day one $10 DLC is pretty damn insulting. And I felt it insulting enough to justify not playing the game. But I did watch it. I watched lots of portions of the game, of course, including the endings, both extended and original. So I do know what was going on there. But honestly, a lot of that is really not necessarily relevant to Andromeda, both in terms of story and in terms of the idea of advancing gameplay and advancing the series from a mechanical standpoint. Of course, when you throw another studio into the mix, one that had had help, certainly, from BioWare Edmonton, and some of the Mass Effect guys were involved in this, but essentially this is their first game. They were being used as a support studio for the main BioWare studio since their inception a few years ago. You're going to have some differences in approach, and some of those are going to be positive, and some of them are certainly going to be negative. So during this video, I'll be going through all of the main components of the game. You can expect very minor spoilers. It's impossible to avoid in such a story-driven game, but I will not be taking part in any major events or spoiling any of the major things that have happened. Just bear in mind that you will most likely be spoiled on the identity of one of the squad mates that you get, and of course on the fate of one of the planets in the game, at least one. That's really unavoidable if you want to see gameplay. If you're looking to go in completely clean, well, now maybe is the time to tune out, or perhaps after I talk about the options menu. As usual, there's a button in the corner to click if you want to skip to gameplay and you'd rather not hear this spiel. To the options menu, and let's have a look and see what we have. Interestingly enough, aim assist is enabled by default, which is unusual. You might want to turn that off. I certainly did. I don't feel that it's necessary or enjoyable when using a keyboard and mouse, and in my opinion that is the best way to play this game, without a doubt. It's well optimized for it, with a couple of exceptions that I will mention. Auto leveling is off by default. You could probably turn this on, honestly. It's not a game in which I think you will be harmed by having auto level on, but personally I like to individually tweak the skills of both my companions and myself, so it's off by default. Mission tracker, usually this is on contextual. I like to have it on always show, simply because the map and the directional indicators in the game could be better, and having it up all the time is a little bit less confusing and helps me keep track of what's supposed to be happening. Conversation icons. We'll talk about the conversation system later on, but these indicate as to the tone of a remark that you are going to make, as well as, in some respects, the consequence. So it's not just about tone, it's about knowing which conversation choices are going to be important and may very well be a choice or make a difference, such as, for instance, starting a romance with somebody, or making a key decision in the game, and which of them are going to tell you what is just ancillary information and not something that will progress the conversation. I have them enabled by default. I don't really see the harm in that. Now, if you want a quick tip, you're probably aware that this game has got some rather dodgy facial animations and lip-syncing issues. Well, if you turn squadmate helmets on as equipped, then at least in missions anyway, you're not going to be seeing an awful lot of that. It's what I like to call the paper bag on the head feature, and it's quite sad that you can't have Ryder and the squad mates wearing helmets all the time. In fact, I'd quite like to see every person in the game wearing a helmet at all times, then I wouldn't be so distracted by the lip-syncing issues. Oh dear. Subtitles on, of course, make this a little bit easier for you to watch, and it does have a field of view multiplier. I have to attest that it would be nice to know what the hell this means. It's a bar without context. I have no idea. In third-person games, they're less necessary, but Mass Effect, in my opinion, has been fairly notorious for having very tight, close-to-the-shoulder field of view that can be somewhat obnoxious to those of us that are affected by such things. I do not know if this applies to the multiplayer. It definitely applies to the single player, and I'd certainly recommend cranking it up a little bit if you can afford to do so when it comes to performance. And we will most assuredly talk about that in a moment. Controls. There are, for the most part, a good set of bindings here, but a couple of issues. You have primary and secondary bindings available, and this game avoids something that quite a lot of BioWare games, especially the Mass Effect series, has fallen into the trap of, and that is having buttons that serve multiple functions on a keyboard. Now, of course, on a controller, that makes a lot of sense, but on a keyboard, it does not, because you've got plenty of buttons available, and Mass Effect had issues with keeping different functions under the same key press. I think a good example of that, if I remember correctly, and it's been quite a while since I played a Mass Effect game, both cover and mantle on the same button. Generally not a good idea, simply because it's very easy to accidentally mantle over cover when you are attempting to actually take cover instead. There were some functions that actually had a single button for maybe 3 or more different functions that you would use on a regular basis. Sometimes it's okay to share functionality. The game does have at least one example of that, if I recall correctly, and that is this right here: camera swap and recenter and look at point of interest. You will never really be put in a situation where both of these commands would conflict. This is something that doesn't happen very often, and you don't even have to use it, so there isn't really a conflict there. And of course, you know, narrative action versus, say, aim down sights. They will never conflict, because they will never happen at the same time. You don't have to worry too much about that. So, it's a nice control scheme. Bear in mind this game does not have a sticky cover option. And you could discuss that in terms of options, but also in terms of mechanics. And I did talk about it quite a bit in the multiplayer video. I stated that I felt that sticky cover had some advantages and disadvantages. I personally don't really like it, and I thought the way that they have done automatic cover in this game has worked well. Through now what has got to be 25 hours of play, which includes a good 5 or so hours in the multiplayer, I have not run into a situation in which my character has not taken cover where they should have. There are, of course, situations where you might run up to a piece of what you think is cover and it ends up not being high enough. It would be maybe nice to have a little bit of an indicator there on the UI as to what was high enough to be cover and what was not. But honestly, I've had no issues with it at all, and that's quite impressive. Is there anything that's missing here? Well, yes, there is. The biggest omission here is the ability to bind weapons to hotkeys. Now, if you scroll down, you will see something called favorites. Favorite 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you might think, oh, right, well, this is a good way to bind consumables and weapons to hotkeys. No. As it turns out, favorite, from what I can tell, only seems to work with the profile system that I'll explain a little bit later. It doesn't work with weapons. Now, at the start of the game, you only have access to an inventory that can hold 2 weapons in your loader at any given time, but you can actually go up to 4, plus you can also go up to, I believe, 4 consumables. These are accessed via a weapon wheel. You can switch between weapons easily with the mouse wheel, but once you get 4 guns, assuming that you want to carry 4 guns, doing that is something of a pain in the arse, and I actually found myself not using consumables all that often because I had to access the weapon wheel in order to do it. If these were bindable to individual hotkeys, I imagine I would be using them a lot more often than I was. So I don't really know why they decided not to include that here. You can argue, well, consoles, but that's never an excuse when dealing with a PC version, because of course you know that people are going to be playing with a keyboard. So you don't need those sort of limitations. I find that irritating, to say the least. I mean, hell, you can even look at these buttons right here. You have consumable buttons in the multiplayer. 4, 5, 6, and 7 right here for Cobra RPG, Revive, Ammo, and First Aid. These could have been included in the single player, and yet they aren't, for whatever reason. These could just be inventory slots, and we could have that displayed on the screen. There's no reason not to do that, and yet it isn't there. Very strange. Not too much of a fan of that. Thankfully, the Nomad controls, which is the vehicle available in the game, work absolutely fine with the keyboard, and I'll talk a bit about how that's used and how enjoyable it is to use a little bit later on. Alright, so far so good. Lots of sensitivity controls available right here. You might want to tweak a few of those, and you even have things like toggle or hold for sustained powers, such as like the flamethrower. You have to hold down the button to keep that going. You can have toggle if you like, if you prefer it, and you've got the same with aiming as well, and sprint too. So these are all nice options to have. This is well put together. Separate audio sliders. The only thing missing here is VoIP volume. For some reason, that function is not in the game, and it is a problem, and I mentioned it in the multiplayer video. Languages, audio, well, English and various text options available right here, as you can quite clearly see. Quite a lot of them. We'll keep it on English. My French is a little rusty. Right, you've got separate video output and graphics menus here. And the video output menu is going to be dealing with your general video settings such as resolution. Ultra-wide is supported, 4K is supported. What I'd like to see here is a drop-down menu because, frankly, switching between resolutions is a pain in the arse when you have separate resolutions with separate refresh rates bound to them. You see how, I mean, there's even a bit of a delay on clicking this, so switching between resolutions is a pain. Drop-down menus. I mean, this is actually a symptom of a much larger problem the game has in terms of menu design, and I'll be talking a lot more about that later on as we deal with things like inventory and crafting and all sorts of things like that. VSync on or off. This game is one of the few PC games to support true HDR. Of course, this is a feature that is going to be included in more games as we go forward, but this game has it. Triple buffering was actually on by default. I turn that off, usually because I'm using G-Sync, and triple buffering really isn't all that helpful there. And you've also got something called frame buffer format. Could really do with explaining what this is. As far as I know, with a high-end graphics card with large VRAM, it's good to have this set to half 16, 64-bit as opposed to 32-bit, but again, I like options menus with explanations as to what all these things are, and, well, this game doesn't have that. So I would hope that that gets added in a future update. Alright, graphics menu, screen calibrations for brightness, safe zone adjustment if you need it. Film grain, that's on by default. I've turned this off in every Mass Effect game because I find it obnoxious. Chromatic aberration, something that a lot of people don't like, have that off for the same reason. Quality presets. Now, there's a few weird things going on with some of these presets. For instance, there's a resolution scale mode. This is becoming more common in PC games, and it's the ability to render the game at a lower native resolution and then basically upscale to the size of the monitor. If you turn this off, you're going to get the same resolution as you set the game to. So, I'm recording in 1080p, it's going to render at 1080p. If you don't, well, you've got this resolution scale thing. At least it gives you some sort of indicator as to what's going on, as well as the resolution scale mode, which can be set to things like 900p, 720p, etc. The game might look worse than you intended to. If the game looks a little bit blurry, these are probably the options you need to look at, because it's probably rendering at a lower resolution than it claims. Texture quality, anti-aliasing, temporal AA, as well as a couple of other options. Let me just go to custom so I could show you what these are. You got temporal AA right there and FXAA. So I keep it on temporal. FXAA, not a particularly good option. I don't necessarily like temporal all that much either, but it is a little better than FXAA, which is Vaseline on the screen effect. Ambient occlusion, full HBAO if you want to hit your system on the head hard there. Post-processing, texture filtering, lighting and shadows, effects and mesh quality, as well as shaders and terrain and vegetation. Now, bear in mind, this is a Frostbite engine game. So there's actually quite a few console commands that can deal with things like motion blur, which is on by default and not something that you can easily turn off. But if you access the console, pretty much all the commands that you were able to use in games like Battlefield, you can use here as well. So that might be something that you want to look into if you find aspects like motion blur to be irritating. The motion blur is not particularly extensive from what I can tell, and I've just sort of left it on. It's not all that obnoxious, but have a look around for Frostbite console commands. You might find those useful, and console is enabled by default. You actually can't turn it off as far as I can tell, which is a little annoying because I've accidentally hit the console button when I meant to hit 1 because tilde's right next to it, and as a result, sausage fingered my way into a horrible multiplayer death. So it would be nice if that was maybe off by default. I can't imagine all that many people are going to use it. Something that's conspicuous by its absence and fairly rare in a Frostbite game is a lack of colorblind or color deficient options. DICE in particular is very much on top of these. BioWare not so much, but it is a Frostbite engine game. It would be nice to see those there. I advocate for those in pretty much any game, so it's a bit unfortunate to see that that is lacking. And then online options here. VoIP, I'm hoping most of this has been sorted out, but you have to mute people by default. With VoIP disabled, we actually found in multiplayer games, bearing in mind it could have been patched since then, it's been a few days since I've played multiplayer, that even when I was going in there with a few of my friends and colleagues, with VoIP disabled, my VoIP was still on. It defaults to push to talk, but certainly earlier on, and again, this may have been patched now, that wasn't working, and microphones are on by default. The workaround for this, which is a pretty clunky one, is to turn VoIP input and output devices to something that doesn't really exist or have anything plugged in. An example here is a digital input in my audio interface. You can see right there, optical input. I'm not using the optical input, so I could use something like that. Sometimes you may also have audio output and input into your monitor, for instance. So I have that as well. There's a great example of it. I can turn VoIP output to my monitor, which doesn't have anything plugged into it. So yeah, people might be yelling and screeching through the VoIP, but I can't hear it. So that's the workaround, but if they haven't fixed this already, they could definitely do with fixing that. And I imagine quite a lot of you might want to turn that off. EA spying, etc., and all that good stuff. So overall, the PC version seems to be pretty good. Performance was an issue before the NVIDIA driver update. I had a huge performance hit on EOS, which is the first and perhaps one of the biggest planets. That was fixed quite handily through that update, but some people are still reporting the game does not perform all that well, and honestly, I'd say it's a pretty demanding game. While people have certainly criticized things like the facial animation and all that sort of thing, the game's environments and lighting effects are stunning. I mean, it's one of the best looking games, I think, on the market in that particular aspect. So yes, it is a demanding game, there's no doubt about it. And I don't think that bizarre animations really reflect poorly on that or disprove that. Those are not performance-related problems. Those are design and polish-related problems. And don't worry, we're not going to sweep those under the rug. All right. Well, we're through all of that. So I think that it is about time to get into this. One final warning. Minor spoilers. Unavoidable. I'll keep it as minimum as possible. All right, here we go. I'd say I'm a good 20 to 25 hours into the campaign. My Origin playtime says 33 hours for the game in general, but quite a bit of that has been spent in things like testing and also while alt-tabbed. So I'm through the first couple of planets, but in this game in particular, you're never really through with most of the planets, and I'll explain why. All right, welcome, eventually, to Mass Effect Andromeda, as we look out over this particular planet and the galaxy map. This is your new ship, the Tempest, and I gotta say, you know, very impressive, at least graphically, from the outset there, but things start to change when you do things like, I don't know, look at faces. We're not going to get into that immediately. I want to explain the structure of the game and stuff first before we get onto that particular elephant in the room. So, the game is structured quite similarly to most BioWare games in the sense that you start off with some cutscenes, and you will then be put into what is generally a pretty combat-heavy area that you can't leave until you've completed. A very linear, small area to introduce you to the game, at which point you'll be thrown into the game's hub area, which you will not be able to leave until certain tasks are being completed. Once you've done that, you will be sent to one large zone, and once you've completed that zone, the game opens up a bit. Now, I'd say this game opens up a little bit less than some other BioWare games. Once I completed the first planet, that being EOS, I got access to 2 other worlds, and there are more than that. So it seems like they have paced it a little bit differently, but for the most part, the structure is pretty much BioWare. All right, let's head on over to that hub, shall we? And show you what's going on with it. This is the galaxy map. And this is what you will be using, needless to say, to navigate the Andromeda Galaxy. This is a planet that I can land on. I know this because it has a landing zone here. And there are, for the most part, planets that you cannot land on. You can scan them. You can visit them if you so desire. And that's what we're going to do. Let's go over here. There's nothing to land on here, but we can head over there regardless. This is a nice little animation of you traveling throughout the system. You've got no little top-down Normandy or anything along those lines here. You get to sweep through the galaxy. And really, it's quite beautiful. The problem is that all of this traversal is unskippable. It looks nice the first couple of times, but you may very well wish to skip these traversal segments later on. The problem is you can't. Under any circumstances, even if you are visiting a planet that has nothing on it. Some people have argued this is a way to hide load screens. Well, I disagree with that on the basis that it still happens when you're visiting planets that have no landing capability. I mean, what is it loading here? Pretty much nothing. The only thing that this did was give me a tiny little bit of lore about this planet. Sometimes you will find things to gather. Sometimes you will detect anomalies which you have to scan for. It's similar in some respects to the way that Mass Effect has previously done galaxy exploration, in the sense that most worlds are just things you can either mine for resources or get little tidbits of world building from. But this traversal aspect gets very irritating very fast. I might add, it also seems to be based on distance, so the further away a world is, the longer it's going to take to fly to. Not only that, but it double dips on this. As you travel from system to system, you get an animation for that, and then as you travel within the system, you get an animation for that too. So if you want to go back to, say, the Nexus, I'll have to go to the galaxy view, travel to that system, big animation for that, and then travel to the station, another animation for that, and then there's another animation when I'm supposed to bloody land on it. It gets a little bit ridiculous, frankly, at one point, I have to say. No doubt about it. You know, I have a theory as to why this exists. The two most popular theories as to why they've put this in the game are, one, hide load screens, which again I think is debunked by the fact that most of these things don't really have anything to load on. And secondly, through the notion of immersion. This idea that, hey, it makes you feel like you're truly traveling amongst the stars. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. But I have a third option, and I think this is the most logical reason as to why this is included. Most of the flying around the galaxy exists solely for gathering resources. And if you did not have something in the way of that, it would be very easy to 100% every system and gather all the resources incredibly quickly. Since there is no challenge whatsoever in the gathering of resources, the scanning minigame from Mass Effect 2 is pretty much gone. It's in fact been transferred to a ground-based thing where you actually do that in the Nomad vehicle. Getting all of these resources requires no skill whatsoever. It requires only time. As a result, I feel that these traversal segments are put in place as a test of patience. They are designed to prevent you from exploring the whole galaxy and gathering all of its resources quickly. It requires a degree of dedication and patience from the player. And I think, frankly, that's pretty terrible. I don't think that's good design. I understand the purpose of it, I understand why it's there, but it's not compelling. If you can't make an exploration system and mining system that is interesting to the player on its own merits, and you're essentially forcing the player to do tedious tasks in order to gain extra resources, then you need to go back to the drawing board and look at that system and see how you can improve it. Some people actually enjoyed the scanning minigame of Mass Effect 2, and others enjoyed the planetary exploration of Mass Effect 1. Yes, you can absolutely argue that some of those planets and moons you land on in Mass Effect 1 were copy-paste, they were very barren, but at least you got to do something. In order to acquire the resources, you had to traverse a landscape and fight stuff, and there were gameplay elements involved in that. But I think this is probably the weakest of all of the Mass Effect games when it comes to the aspect of planet exploration for resources. Again, a pure test of patience. Nothing but that. A lot of these planets don't even have any resources to gather. This one does. There's an anomaly, you click it, a probe is launched, you get some resources from it. Simple as that. Click it, I got some aluminium. Isn't that wonderful? That's the reason to go to planets, really. Nothing more than that. Occasional little pieces of world building and lore. Alright. So that's that out the way. Like I said, these unskippable scenes, frankly, in my opinion, need to be patched out. Or at least made optional. I understand why they're there, but they're there to cover for something which is not very well fleshed out and is frankly just tedious. I'm going to head over to the Nexus right here. This is the hub area, and this will allow me to demonstrate the kind of things that you can expect in terms of dialogue and picking up quests and so on and so forth. And then we're going to head to a planet to show you this zone-based exploration and questing. Off we go. We'll eventually get there. Now I've got to go to the right system to get there, and then I've got to watch a landing screen, and I can kind of understand to some extent why they have that. That probably is hiding a loading screen, but let's be honest, not allowing you to skip once loading is complete is ridiculous, considering that that is already a feature of the game. For instance, a great example of that would be the fact that on the Nexus, you have a tram that takes you between various areas of the Nexus. You can skip those scenes. Once the area is loaded, it lets you skip them. On my machine, it takes about 2 seconds before the skip button is made available. Yet in these scenes, when it comes to landing and disembarkation, it's not available. And yes, that looks great, but once you've seen it 3 or 4 times, you don't want to see it again. You hammer the spacebar, nothing happens, and it's a little bit of a miserable experience. It's like, I don't need to see this. You know, this takes, you know, a good 30 or so seconds, and I know everything's already loaded. I know this because I've seen it happen on the tram. So why inflict it upon you time and time again? It's one of the many things that this game does which generates a degree of minor annoyance, and those things can stack up to become far more severe, a far bigger problem. So, I gotta say, the Nexus really is no Citadel. It is a very nice thing to look at, no doubt about it, but I found the Citadel, especially in Mass Effect 1, to be a very compelling place to explore. It's a good job because you are forced to explore it for a fairly large period of time at the start of the game. Thankfully, it was full of interesting races and characters. The Nexus, not so much. There are some interesting things that happen. There are some interesting people to talk to, but I don't think it has the same character as the Citadel. And of course, maybe that's on purpose. This is a hodgepodge of a station. It's not really working out all that well over here in the Andromeda Galaxy. The Initiative has not done a great job so far, and frankly, they're in a bit of a panic. No, they're in a situation where they might very well all die off because they'll run out of resources or be destroyed. The station, in some ways, isn't fully built. It's kind of falling apart. And there is an overall theme of desperation, but also, of course, a degree of optimism. I think it leans maybe a little too far towards the optimistic. I would quite like to see Mass Effect Andromeda have a much grimmer tone to it, more of a Battlestar Galactica tone. Frankly, in their situation, it would be entirely understandable that everybody is desperate and not particularly happy. Sure, bring in moments of levity and optimism as you start to make your way through, but honestly, I think that, for the most part, the game should maybe be a little bit more depressing than it is. That's just a personal, subjective preference, though.
This is the head of the Angaran delegation.
The one who saved the Moshai. She speaks highly of you. Call me Issa de Navarre.
Welcome, Ambassador. The Angara's first formal visit will be one for the history books.
I wonder what they'll say.
I was just explaining to the Ambassador that armed guards aren't necessary here.
Is something wrong, Ambassador?
Please walk with me, Pathfinder. So much life. All different, all united. The way it could have been. 75 years ago, we were scattered, struggling to rebuild after the Scourge. Then, the Ket arrived. Alien life. It was monumental. But then they deceived and enslaved us. So, I hope you understand my precautions.
We came to explore, Ambassador, not conquer. And we have our own challenges.
Yes, which is why I'm here. I want to believe in this alliance, Pathfinder. The Moshai says you're trustworthy. Please, help me trust in you.
We don't expect you to enter this alliance blindly, Ambassador. Everything we say, you can check.
You'd be that open with us?
We have nothing to hide.
They'll surrender their weapons to your militia, if that's satisfactory.
Thank you. We won't disappoint you, Ambassador.
Havoa Sek Jav Jaravon, Pathfinder. Welcome to Andromeda.
That was quite an appropriate little conversation to have, because it simultaneously addresses part of the elephant in the room, but also indicates that that elephant in the room might be a little exaggerated, a little hyperbolic. Straight up conversation between the main character and an Angaran diplomat. In my opinion, a pretty damn well written one. There wasn't a single line of that dialogue that made me think, well, that's cringeworthy, or that's out of character. Admittedly, a lot of that had to do with the dialogue that I chose. I decided to go down a more serious route. If you go down a more sarcastic or jokey route, or in some cases a very compassionate route, there are certainly times when Ryder can say things that you would not have necessarily said yourself or that sound somewhat cringeworthy or cliched. Gotta say, to suggest that BioWare has not had run-ins with trope-ridden dialogue, with some cringeworthy lines or cliched writing, is, at best, I think, clouded by nostalgia, and at worst, just outright false. But you may have noticed during that cutscene that Ryder's facial expressions were a little off. Eye movement was a little unusual, and there were occasionally camera angles that were inadvisable. That's really a fairly consistent problem during the game. The writing, that's a very subjective complaint. There are definitely moments that are worthy of YouTube videos mocking them. My face is tired is probably one you've already heard of. Yeah, that was ridiculous. There are some other lines, like my personal motto is, I got this, and stuff like that, which I believe, I'm not sure if you can even avoid saying that. But the majority of the writing seems to be just fine. And I think that you can break that writing down into subcategories when it comes to trying to critique it. There is the overall story, which is of course affected by the writing, since most of that story is delivered through dialogue, and then of course some through the things that you do. And then there's things like interaction between NPCs and interaction between squad mates. And to me, the most important part of a Mass Effect game when it comes to dialogue, as my shadow inexplicably flickers in the background right there, one of many little cosmetic issues this game has, is the interaction between the main character and my companions. That's what I remember most from Mass Effect. Talking with Garrus in the weapons room, talking with Rex, the interactions with all of these really cool, memorable companions that I shared a very lengthy journey with. And a lot of Mass Effect players are going to have that memory, and they're going to be very attached to it. So to start again here with a new set of companions is going to be a tricky one. It's going to be very difficult to compare to that, especially when it is in many ways affected by nostalgia. But there's no doubt that part of immersion into the delivery of dialogue is facial animation. Because that's what we're doing these days. We don't just do text, we don't just keep the camera above the heads of the people anymore, no. We change camera angles. And in this case, some of the camera angles are very suspect, I tend to find. I actually prefer consistency when it comes to camera angles. I remember all the way back to the original Deus Ex. Really, they only kind of had two camera angles for the most part. It was either straight on the face or to a acute angle of the face. And that was about it. That was really all there was to it. But this game tries a bunch of different camera angles. Some of them work well. Some of them just exacerbate some of the problems that the lip syncing and animation have, which is not a particularly good idea, and it certainly makes that much, much more noticeable. In terms of the dialogue, though, most of it has been pretty reasonable. There are funny moments. There are moments of levity. There are moments of sincerity. And I'm encountering more and more of those as I go on. Honestly, my biggest problem with that dialogue is the overall tone is, in my opinion, a little bit too light, and as a result, it doesn't really match up to the situation that these guys are in. That said, when there are hopeful moments, those moments feel genuinely satisfying as a result of that optimism, as a result of renewing the hope in the eyes of the hopeless. Although, frankly, a lot of these guys are maybe a little bit too cheerful to be the hopeless, stranded out in an unknown galaxy with all of their plans having failed, and their family either killed or kept in cryostasis because they simply don't have the resources to maintain a large population. That is a very desperate situation. So, the question is, what do you do to resolve it? Well, this is where things get interesting, and of course, it is the meat of the game in general. I'm going to head back to the Tempest, and we're going to go land on a planet. So your goal as a Pathfinder is to find habitable worlds for these people. When the expedition launched 600 years ago, they'd identified what are called golden worlds. Basically areas that they had marked for colonization, that they were pretty sure through long-range scans were going to be great places to live. Well, it turns out once they got there, that wasn't the case. I won't tell you why, but it's now a desperate situation. Where do these guys live? Where do they gather resources? The Nexus is running out of resources. Some of the people that were supposed to get there didn't. There are mysteries surrounding these so-called arcs that were the large ships sent across dark space to reach this area. Well, it's your job to resolve that. I won't tell you exactly how you do it, but I will describe a system that is bound into the whole notion of creating what's called planetary viability, because not only is this a storyline element, they have created a mechanic that is bound into it. We're going to travel to Eos, and I can demonstrate exactly what I mean by that, because the way that they handle progression and tie that progression into the story is, in my opinion, one of the strongest aspects of the game, and is a very interesting discussion when it comes to the idea that gameplay and story and game mechanics can all be intertwined into a larger whole. And indeed, that's a way to fully realize the potential of this medium. There are very few games that have really done that in a fantastic way. I keep referring to Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons as a game that married story with mechanics, and even, indeed, the way that you interfaced with your characters to truly deliver emotional moments. And I think it's one of the finest examples of games that have done that. But to a lesser extent, Mass Effect Andromeda also does that. I'm going to go land, and I'll show you some of this gameplay, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So this is the loadout screen. Very similar to some previous Mass Effect games. You can have up to 4 weapons, which is quite nice. It's nice to be able to carry more, but you should bear in mind that there is also a weight system. This was part of Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. It's the same with the single player here. It discourages you from carrying a lot of heavy weapons, and you may very well decide to lighten your load just a little bit. You can even pick a melee weapon, which is fairly unusual. I have a cryo gauntlet here, which is a pretty cool piece of tech, and this is a sword that I just crafted, and I was very happy to be able to get that. Melee is something that is more integrated into the combat in this game than previous Mass Effect games. Now in this loadout screen, you'll notice that I have these weapons. They also have rankings. You can get up to level 5 in pretty much every weapon, so they get better over time. And there's a crafting system tied into all of this that I'll go into in depth a little bit later. There's also a mod system, so I can apply different mods to my gun, and as you'll notice, there are cosmetic effects to doing so, which is quite neat. You know, this melee add-on is something that fundamentally changes the look of the weapon. And those looks actually vary depending on what kind of technology you're using. These are weapons that you should be familiar with. These are weapons from the Milky Way, from previous Mass Effect games, but there are plenty of weapons that are not. And some of them certainly look quite unusual, very alien. I don't believe I'm actually carrying any of those. I mean, the Disciple is a Milky Way weapon, but it's not an alien weapon from the Andromeda galaxy. What's nice about this, by the way, is that the add-ons actually change depending on which weapon you're using. In this case, you've got a very different-looking melee add-on, which is a nice little bit of detail, and they're shown in combat as well. The mod customization system is quite strong, although I would say the augment system, which is part of the crafting system, again, we'll get onto this. Game is a very large game with a lot of systems built on top of other systems, is even more interesting than the mods. You can also customize armor, and that's broken down to 4 kinds of pieces here. Again, those have levels, and you can also mod them as well. The stats vary. What would be nice to see, which is part of a larger problem in the UI, is the stats and benefits of these armor pieces at a glance. If I want to see them, I have to go into this menu here. And you might think that's not too bad, but there are some even worse examples of this in other parts of the game where information is just buried under too many menus. There's no reason as to why those stats couldn't be on the screen right now. I'd love to see that. It would give me an indicator at a glance as to what I'm using and whether or not I want to change that. You can bring consumables in. This includes different ammo types, as well as things like the Cobra RPG, shield capacitors, healing kits, and all that sort of thing. I admit I don't use these all that often, although I'm starting to use them a little more now that I'm encountering tougher enemies, but there is a UI reason for that. You remember I mentioned during the options menu, and maybe you didn't if you skipped it, that you can't bind these to specific keys? Well, a lot of it's got to do with that. I'd rather not use the weapons wheel, so I tend to avoid using these. Squad mates. All right. So you can customize these. Again, it would be nice to have a drop-down menu here. You actually have to you have to select the person with the spacebar, or double-click, and then you get this menu here. which allows you to select your different squad mates. You can take up to 2 on a mission, needless to say. I believe this is the full roster. You get almost all the roster on the first planet, and then one more just slightly later. I won't spoil which. In terms of loadout and customization, you can't do that anymore with your squad mates. You can't give them weapons or equipment. This was something that they were in the process of or had phased out entirely towards the end of Mass Effect 3. They've been doing this throughout the series. And in this case, there is minimal customization. You can level up your squad mates and you can level up various abilities, but there are very limited numbers of abilities, and you will not be able to actually activate them yourself. We'll talk about that in combat a little bit later. You can also customize the Nomad, and now it looks really cool, doesn't it? You can get different paint jobs. You can also customize it with different upgrades. All right, we have ourselves a loadout. We have ourselves a squad. I'll just show you the weight system briefly. If I threw the Widow sniper rifle in here, it would vastly reduce my power recharge speed. And I use my powers quite often, so you know what? I would prefer not to do that. I hit V to unequip. It's a bit of an odd one, isn't it? Now, there's these curious things, like right-click would be logical to unequip this, but V? It's a bit of a weird one. Just a symptom of some strange UI design. This is by far not the worst part of it. You'll see most of that in inventory and crafting and codexes later. But we're ready to go, and hell, 46 minutes in, you'd probably like to see me shoot something, right? I did say this would be an in-depth video. There's a lot to talk about here. Down we go. Once again, unskippable. What's annoying about this unskippable aspect is that sometimes I actually want to go back on the ship to just do a little bit of crafting or something, or pick up some rewards. You can't do that without taking off, which is silly. I don't really understand that process. And I'd also add that I feel the loadout system is unnecessary. Considering the stuff is already kept in your limited inventory, I see no reason at all, frankly, to not allow you to simply equip things directly from the inventory menu. If I hit I, this is my inventory, this is all the stuff I've got, I can't change it without going to a place that lets me change my loadout. Now, these are relatively frequent, and you can fast travel to most of them as well. These little pods are basically checkpoints that will come down on the planet when you reach and explore certain parts of it. They can be used to call a Nomad in certain situations. They can be used to retrieve some messages and emails, and a little bit of world building, and you can change your loadout this way as well. But you can't do crafting and research, which is a little annoying. It would just be nice if the loadout system was made obsolete. There's no reason, I feel, not to allow you to simply equip whatever weapon. It may be that they simply wanted to restrict you and force you into a particular playstyle, but surprisingly enough, this game actually doesn't really do that as much as other Mass Effect games. We'll talk again a little bit more about that once I explain the general game flow. This is a colony here, and this is the map of this area. And you might notice here a viability meter. This is key to your progression. And viability indicates just how livable a world is. And really, it's your goal to make these worlds livable. That is the main goal that you have going on. There are a ton of objectives all over the place right here. Lots of them. Side objectives, forward stations to find, mining areas, and this is just one part of the map. If we head on up, you'll see that this map has multiple layers, and as I drive around, you'll see it's a pretty large, fairly open desert planet for the most part. And you might be thinking, oh, that sounds like Hinterlands from Dragon Age Inquisition, and that was a big open and, in the eyes of many, myself included, pretty damn dull area. Yeah, but I think that EOS in particular is a much better planet. It's a much better opening zone than the Hinterlands was. It is large, and certainly it is a desert, but there's a lot going on in it, and traversal is quite enjoyable. You might have noticed that I was able to jump with a, not so much a jump jet, this is a biotic jump. This actually varies depending on what class you're playing right now, which is a pretty cool idea. Doesn't really affect the playstyle all that much, but you can switch between what are called profiles using the F keys, and that'll actually change the nature of your jump, which is in itself a pretty cool thing. I can actually demonstrate that for you if we switch to the engineer profile. I actually have jump jets now, and a jump dash instead of a biotic jump. Cool little idea, honestly. It's very interesting to see what was once a fairly rigid class system change into something that is very flexible and allows you to change. It doesn't really lock you into your decisions. traversal in general on this planet is great, and on all planets is pretty damn good because of the access to those jump jets and dashes. You're not stuck on a slow horse anymore. You've got this pretty, in my opinion anyway, pretty damn awesome vehicle that has jump jets, a boost, a 6-wheel drive mode. It can climb hills, and of course you can change and upgrade its ability to do just that. It's not going to stop you from going many places, unless of course you're trying to go up vertical faces. As you drive around this, you may very well find mining areas. I'm apparently currently in one, but be damned if the game seems to realize that. And this lets you drop mining probes. This is quite similar to the Mass Effect 2 mining system, whereby you detect areas that are rich in minerals, and then you drop a probe on that area. You can also fast travel amongst most of these areas, which again makes traversal enjoyable, but just take a second to look at that view distance and the quality of the environment and how awesome this looks. It's a desert, but it's a damn pretty desert. The Frostbite engine does incredible sky domes, it does incredible view distance and environments, and Mass Effect Andromeda is absolutely no exception to that. Now you might have noticed the map, again, is pretty damn large, and if I happen to select a quest either from the Codex and the Journal, or just by clicking on one of these objectives on the map, it's going to highlight everything related to that. There's a basic task here. Go find some drones that were missing. A pretty dull little quest, but the interesting thing about that is that most of those sort of dull MMO-like quests are reserved for after you've started to stabilize the planet. The initial quests that resulted, and they're shooting me, I'm just going to back off for a second, we'll get into combat in a minute. The initial questing that started the viability of this planet are actually very interesting, and there was a distinct lack of MMO-like fetch questing and nonsense. The few that there were well placed, and you would generally be able to do them as you traversed the planet to deal with the main quests. There's a bit of a bug with these bugs, by the way. They are buggy bugs. Sometimes you can run them over, sometimes you just clip through them, which is a little bit weird, but hey, there you go. If you wouldn't mind going away, that would be quite nice. There was a big problem I had with the hinterlands initially. There were just too many dull quests. I think Andromeda does a far better job of providing you with more interesting quests, as well as contextualizing everything you're doing. I mentioned this idea of viability earlier. Well, almost every quest that you do contributes to planetary viability and earns you what are called Andromeda points. You can have a look at that if you like. Andromeda viability. EOS, it's quite viable, really, isn't it? As you can see. These are, there's 5 planets that you will eventually be able to turn into homes. It's a way of representing not only how good the planet is to live on and how friendly it is to life, but also the morale of the colonists and the overall success and viability of the initiative. This is something that I don't hear talked about a lot, and I think needs to be talked about. Because to me, this is one of the big strengths of Mass Effect Andromeda. I'm not much of an RPG guy, I have to admit. And when it comes to dealing with the trappings of open world games and quests and such, I can rapidly get tired and bored. But one of the ways to motivate you to take part in these quests is through context and through rewarding you in a meaningful way in-game. This planetary viability system means that all of these little quests like find this guy's lost daughter or fix up this little area of the planet, they all exist for a good reason. Even raising the morale of the colonists by finding someone that they had previously thought lost, yes, it improves the viability of the overall effort. Of course it would. You're winning hearts and minds. You're raising the morale of the people involved in the initiative, and that is important to the overall effort. And that is what, in my opinion, is far more important to my style of play than the nebulous concept of story. And I use little Turian quotes for that. Story. What is story? In video games, story is not only the cutscenes and the dialogue and the things that they present you, but in my opinion, how you interact with those things, and also what you do during the vast majority of the game. Driving around here, taking part in quests and all that sort of thing. I feel that story is strongest when everything is tied together and creates a stronger whole. This whole idea of Andromeda viability and being rewarded for doing so, it's a great motivation. It's a motivation as somebody that quite likes role-playing. Although I kind of hesitate to call Mass Effect an RPG at this point, but that's another video for another time. It is a motivation for somebody that is very gameplay-focused to see that I am being consistently rewarded for the things that I do in a way that makes sense in the world, in the overall universe. That to me is a far more important aspect of the story because it's actually about the fantasy. Immersing yourself in the fantasy of being the Pathfinder, whose job it is to lead the initiative, scout out new worlds, and make this place habitable for your people. Everything in the game is geared towards that idea. And the gameplay systems and the writing are all tied in there, which, in my opinion, makes for a compelling story, a compelling fantasy that I can immerse myself in. When I say you get rewarded for this, by the way, I do mean that quite literally. Not only in terms of experience, but you are also given these Nexus levels. These Nexus levels allow you to bring these blocks of people out of cryostasis. This, again, is part of the story. You don't have the resources to support everybody, so most people are left in cryopods because you can't feed them, you can't clothe them, you can't support them. But as you are successful, and the initiative has more resources to work with, you are able to make the decision to wake up certain blocks of people. And that actually has an in-game benefit. You're able to wake up, say, a group of scouts who is able to periodically bring you certain kinds of resources. You are gaining passive benefits as you progress, gain more Andromeda points, and help the initiative. Again, ties very well into the story, but gives you a concrete, real benefit. I love that. All right, let's get on to some fighting. You've seen quite enough talking. Let's fight. We are going to do that, and these guys are going to regret that they have ever been spawned. The combat system. Arguably the strongest part of Mass Effect Andromeda. However, it is by no means something that everybody agrees on. Let's get that sword out that I just made. There we go. Very nice. This sword sets people on fire. And that's not a bug, by the way. That's a kind of smoke screen that these guys are suffering from. Okay, what's obviously good about the combat? Well, in my opinion, jump jets, dashes, mobility. There is less of a focus on cover in this game than there was in the previous Mass Effect games. Cover is not always invulnerable. A lot of it can be destroyed. Many enemies have abilities that can flush you out of cover, and as a result, it encourages you to be mobile. And that's exactly what you do. Not only the Vanguard class, with its biotic charge, but every class has the ability to dash in and out of cover, use their jump jets, even air dash to dodge incoming fire. You will find if you are not in cover or using these abilities, you will die very quickly. So the game kind of gives you a choice. Do you want to hug cover, or do you want to be mobile? I like being mobile. I actually picked the Vanguard initially because I was under the impression that most of these other classes would be very cover-oriented. As it turns out, no. You could be mobile with any class, although there are certain classes that are focused more on mobility than others. Add to that a wide variety of weapons, bigger focus on melee, including this awesome-looking ground pound that you can imbue with different, I suppose you call them elemental attributes. Yeah, that's probably the best way to describe them. I can't do it while I don't have my gun out, obviously. This one, I've actually imbued part of my equipment with an electrical shock, which does damage to shields and can stun and all that sort of thing, which is quite cool. And you have this mobile system. The guns feel and sound phenomenal. I picked shotguns because I was a little bit worried about time to kill. I'm not so worried about it, at least on normal mode at any rate. I don't play Mass Effect games on higher difficulty because, again, of that time to kill aspect. I don't like bullet spongy enemies. I do feel that sci-fi games give you something of an out in terms of immersion. You're not shooting people with real guns that you can recognize in the head several times and having 45 caliber. Is that correct? I bet everyone's gonna hate me now. It's like, yeah, the assault clip magazine. Yeah, whatever. You're not having 45 caliber bullets be deflected by a hoodie, as you would be in, say, the Division. You got shields. You have futuristic armor. You have biotic barriers. These are all important things. But for the most part, at least on normal, the enemies, they're not all that spongy. And you can utilize things like combos, biotic combos, elemental combos. If I set an enemy on fire and then use my biotic charge, then I'll do huge damage and also generate an effect. Usually, if it's a fire combo, it generates a huge fiery inferno that sets everybody nearby on fire. There's like a stun combo with the disruption and electrical-based abilities. These are all nice elements to the combat system, and your squad mates will generally try and combo up with you when they can. However, as much as I say to you, hey, these are all great things and I truly love the combat system, there is a degree of preference involved here, because some people enjoyed the cover-based, more tactical combat with pauses that was offered by Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3. You cannot control your squad mates' abilities this time around. You can only tell them where to go. So, I'm sure we'll be able to find some combat because my rover is currently on fire and people are shooting at me. So, there are no doubt some enemies around here. We'll get out and we'll fight. I can tell my squad mates to target a particular person, to enter cover, or to rally and retreat and reset. That's really about it. The thing is that the Mass Effect games usually had the ability to manually control the use of your squad mates' abilities, almost as if you had them yourself. They were instantaneous, very responsive. Don't worry, these are homing bolts I'm not deliberately missing. I can fire them over there, and for the most part, they will hit. Sometimes, not always. Slow projectiles, but there you go. The inability to do that is going to upset some people. Now, I err on the side of I prefer more action-oriented combat. There are games that do the idea of positioning your squad mates very, very well. Star Wars Republic Commando is one of the best examples. Another would be, going back even further, Full Spectrum Warrior, a military third-person shooter that was more of a strategy game than anything else. If that's what you were looking for from Mass Effect, this is going to disappoint you. And I admit, there are times when I miss the ability to hit a hotkey and immediately have my squad mate smash an opponent with a concussive shell and then follow it up with some sort of combination. But I do enjoy the mobility and action-oriented nature and not necessarily having to micromanage my squad mates. Not that you really had to do that on lower difficulty levels in previous Mass Effect games. I think a happy medium could have been reached, honestly. Evidently, they didn't want to do that, which is perhaps unfortunate. I wouldn't have minded the inclusion of that, honestly. I think it would have probably been a good inclusion. But the jump jets, the mobility, even this whole hover aspect here. If you aim down sights, you have the ability to briefly hover, which allows you to aim in the air, get a height advantage over certain enemies, avoid shields, hit them in weak spots. Very cool little addition. You can also buff that up. You can even become a very aerial-oriented class, if you wish, by upgrading your equipment and getting skills which boost up your jump jets, biotic jumps, and all sorts of things like that. There's a lot going on in that regard. So yeah, I think for the most part, the combat system is a good one. And as I have mentioned, the automatic cover, obviously that's not working while I have my weapon holstered. The automatic cover works well. I have not encountered a situation where cover has occurred when I didn't want it, or has not occurred when I did. I have no doubt that at some point someone will, but I haven't. I think the auto cover works fairly well, although some people do like that sticky cover. Honestly, like I said, the game isn't so cover-oriented this time around in terms of combat, so I'm not really that worried about it. Now, we were talking about the combat and the weapons. Well, that's inextricably tied into a couple of things. Your character's abilities and your character's gear. Let's talk about that. So this is an inventory which has a wide variety of different weapons and mods and so on and so forth. And of course, the inventory is utterly useless when you're not at a loadout station. Silly, really, isn't it? Really quite silly. I have no idea why they made that decision, but that's also a thing Mass Effect's been doing since 2, so maybe you can just argue that that's the way that it is. If we head over to skills, you'll see the progression. You have 3 main trees: combat, biotics, and tech. Pretty much every skill this time around is related to combat and exploration. You're not going to be getting skills related to dialogue. That's all gone out of the window. We've headed more in the Fallout 4 direction, and of course the direction of more recent Mass Effect games than Fallout 1 and 2, and so on and so forth. And of course previous BioWare games that had skills that would influence non-combat oriented abilities. There's a lot of choice here. A lot of choice. And I feel that the amount of choice given here in terms of the abilities that you can grab both passive and active is great. You can pick a weapon choice and really invest in it. And you can see the benefits that I got from buffing up shotguns. Every one of these abilities has a tree. The first 3 ranks, they're set in stone, but then you have mutually exclusive abilities, and some of these get very powerful. The ability to put down cover with Barricade right here. You can upgrade that. Get an extra power cell so you can do it more often. Increase the duration. And then maybe you decide at that point, well, I like the Barricade, but it doesn't stick around for that long, so I can take that. But maybe I just want to use it more often, so I can take power cells instead. So you got a good amount of choice here, and the final abilities are generally very, very powerful indeed. For the most part, even the passive abilities tone up your strength in a satisfying way. I don't really like abilities that are minor percentage upgrades. I find those to be quite boring, but even in this game where you have some minor upgrades, they get really significant really fast, you know? In this case, combat fitness, 9% health and 9% shields, that's a lot. And of course, at rank 3, you get the weapon loadout and all sorts of things like that. Then you can choose between more consumables, better consumables, health regen. These are big upgrades that do an awful lot. Some of these abilities are locked. You have to invest a certain number of points into a tree in order to get them. I think Flat Cannon is one of them. Possibly Turbocharge is another. And if we head to Biotics, you can see things like that as well. Singularity is a very powerful ability. I like the fact, of course, that you can see what those abilities do over there. That's a great thing that quite a few games have been doing lately. Just have a look at a glance. And there are so many choices here. Now, you are able to mix and match pretty much as you desire. And there are so-called profiles, which replace classes, that supplement this. You can see I got charge. I don't know why it's gone back to pull. I keep trying to change this. I assign the power and it keeps forgetting for some reason. I actually swapped out to singularity right here. There we go. I don't really want pull anymore. So I'm mostly biotic, but I do have a flamethrower. Because I felt like it. I wanted a flamethrower, damn it. Well, the game let me do that. So I appreciate that. And for the most part, you can dip into these different trees and truly customize your combat abilities. Not only that, but you can swap between them on the fly. And this is a very interesting and a great addition to the game, in my opinion. It's profiles. You start off by picking a class, but what the game doesn't tell you is that you didn't really pick a class. You picked an ability. I chose Vanguard at the start, and I got Charge. Great. Well, as it turns out, I don't even need to have that. The Vanguard profile is what gives me Charge initially, but you can actually use Charge on any class if you want. The profiles are... It's hard to call them classes because they are abilities that let you passively increase the effectiveness of certain playstyles, and they rank up. So you have to invest a certain number of points to unlock each profile. The very early one you get is this one, Explorer. It's a jack-of-all-trades kind of thing. And it lets you do some pretty cool stuff, like you can blink through solid objects, which is very useful. And you get bonuses to a wide variety of different things. Now, as you start to specialize and figure out what playstyle you like, you'll probably find that these profiles level up and get more powerful. Because I've invested a ton of skill points into combat and biotics, I'm now a frontline fighter, which is a rank 2 Vanguard. And the more I invest, the more powerful this is, and it gives me more great passive abilities and bonuses. And these are significant increases in power. I mean, 60% melee force, 25% melee damage, a lot extra shields, and my melee strikes restore shields as well. These are significant. And you can define, as I mentioned earlier, favorites, which, bit clunky to do this, honestly. Again, another UI problem the game has, which lets you switch between these whenever you like. And each of these can be set up with a different weapon and power loadout. So I can switch in certain situations between a defensive tech-orientated guy and an offensive biotic-orientated guy, if I like. This is a great solution to the problems that a lot of games that have these RPG and class elements have. Because you're not locked in anymore. You can also respec if you want. They get increasingly expensive, but you can do it. So this game offers you a lot of freedom in how you approach combat. And if you don't like an ability, pick another one. You're not locked into it. If you don't like a profile, switch to another one. You can even do it in the middle of combat, I believe, but it puts all of your abilities on cooldown. So just bear that in mind. There is a little bit of balance that's thrown in there for good measure. Great system, in my opinion, and very much supplements that combat-focused aspect of the game. The only weakness I think it has is in terms of your squad mates. There's not a lot to choose from here, really. 2 passives, 3 actives, and the final active is an ultimate that requires a certain number of points invested in the skills. I'd like to see this fleshed out a little bit more. Since you can't control your companions, I guess it's a bit understandable that this is fairly shallow, but it's a shame. I would like to see a bit more, especially considering I can't even customize their gear. Squad mates are, outside of the dialogue, something of an afterthought, and they certainly don't do a huge amount of damage, I've found. Although, if I'm running around with the Krogan, he tends to headbutt people to death pretty well. So I'll give him credit for that. So what have we got through so far? Combat, leveling up, abilities, progression, all that sort of thing. We have, of course, talked a little bit as well about the elephant in the room. Dialogue, animations. Animations, as you probably noticed, don't really affect the movement of the character or the combat, which is why I'm less bothered by them, honestly. If there were poor animations when dealing with combat, I would not be happy. For obvious reasons. Why would I be? I am very much focused on good game mechanics. If I don't have them, then obviously I'm going to be somewhat upset about that, right? Well, that's not really a problem, as I mentioned in the multiplayer video, but there are undoubtedly issues with facial animation, not just facial animation, but even some of the movement in cutscenes. I mean, hell, even outside of cutscenes, I'm not massively keen on how well some of the squad mates are animated in the way that they traverse the terrain. Some of them get stuck in walls, some of them teleport. I've seen people floating in midair. Does it affect the gameplay? Well, no. As soon as you get into combat, they generally teleport right to you. So they're not going to get stuck or anything, but they certainly take you out of the experience. No real doubt about that. Lip syncing, facial animation. It's a weak point. Some of it's awful. Some of it's average. I wouldn't really call any of it necessarily good, but I certainly wouldn't describe any of it as a deal breaker for me. For some of you, though, if you're very much focused on that dialogue, yeah, you are going to be disappointed, and it might be a deal breaker for you. And honestly, I'm not going to blame you for that in the slightest. Why on earth would I? It's a perfectly valid criticism, and something that shouldn't have happened. I'm not going to excuse them for it. As to how much it affects your enjoyment of the game, well, that's, frankly, something that you're going to have to make a decision on. I'm heading back here because usually they have the ability to customize loadouts and sometimes head back to the Tempest. I believe once you've fully fleshed out a map, you can sort of get back there quite easily. There's the Tempest right there. The map gets a bit cluttered, as you've probably noticed. You can turn Show Legend on or off, but you have to zoom in quite heavily. And it's a 3-dimensional map that doesn't let you change the camera angle. So in some situations, things like height becomes a little difficult to see. And there are certain areas where you might think, well, I can just get to this point on the map quite easily and then run into, quite literally, a brick wall that you can't traverse. The game could very much use some sort of GPS system, breadcrumbs on the ground, to identify the optimal route. I'd appreciate that. Most of the time, there might be a dust trail or something that you can navigate there. But sometimes I have run into situations where I thought I was going in the right direction and then end up not doing that at all. You'll notice all of the highlights on the compass at the top there. That'll give you a rough indication of where you're supposed to be going. But what I would like to see on this map, and notice again a ton of wasted space, is a list of quests down the right-hand side here that I could just select. If I want to select a particular quest, either I have to hover over all of these indicators, and some of the planets have a lot of them, to say, oh, right, this is the one that I want to go towards. Because if you don't highlight it, they're probably just going to appear as very similar looking hexagons, white hexagons here. But if I want to do that, I've got to go to the journal, check this out, and in some situations, the quests are buried. There are priority ops, quests related to allies, quests related to assignments within the Helios sector, and all that kind of thing. And sometimes it'll be difficult to find the quest that you were looking for. This is where most of the side quests are. But what's pretty annoying about this is that these aren't broken down by planet. Some are. If I want to break down important quests by planet, I can do this, as you can see. But if I want to break down side quests that way, I can't do it. Better crafting, for instance. I don't even know if there is a single aspect of this anywhere on this planet. Probably not. But it's all listed in this giant scrollable list that just gets bigger over time. And it's difficult to manage. You could put down a waypoint at least, but it would be nice to be able to mark multiple quests and also, again, have that list on the map. Why not? Look at all this space. This is one of the bigger planets, and you're telling me I can't fit a list of quests to click here? That's one of several examples of pretty damn poor UI design. And it becomes increasingly problematic if you decide to engage in certain aspects of the game, which of course include crafting. Let's show you a little bit of that. This game has a very in-depth crafting system. So in turn, that also means you have a much wider variety of equipment that you can use. More variety, I think, than any of the Mass Effect games. Even if you go back to Mass Effect 1, where it was straight up loot drops and gear, I'd say that this game has by far surpassed Mass Effect 2 and 3 in the variety of weapons and armor that you can pick up, but it's not drowning you in equipment in the way that Mass Effect 1 was, where it was giving you tons of almost identical pieces of gear. There is something it is drowning you in, though, and that is damn crafting resources. Welcome to the Tempest. Let's go and do a little bit of crafting and show you a system which I like, but has simultaneously infuriated me. The central part of the Tempest here allows you to access various useful things. Remember earlier I was talking about the Andromeda point system and the ability to bring people out of cryostasis? There's a great example of that. I have some pods here, and I've got my special forces working on getting me tech materials. The more of these I unlock, the more benefits I get, and I'll come back here to collect those every once in a while. And you can get people out of cryostasis without having to go back to the Nexus. Convenient. Strike teams are available right here. I mentioned these to some extent in my multiplayer video, but you can also use them in the single player, and indeed you should. This is an adaptation of the war table from Dragon Age Inquisition. You have these teams that you can send off on missions. They will get you loot, mission funds, and you can gear them up. They'll also level up as well. So I can equip them, if I wish, by heading over here, looking at my strike team, and saying, all right, what is my strike team able to do? Well, they have a bunch of traits that, frankly, should be hover over tooltips and are not. Why? Who bloody knows? If I want to equip them, I go through this menu here, spend resources, and it gives me some little traits here that are going to buff their ability to complete these missions. Pretty nice amount of customization. And if I hit X, that will allow me to view the traits and what they do. This is yet another example of poor UI design. There is no reason at all not to have that information here. Look at all this wasted space. We can send them off on a mission, and they will maybe succeed or fail. They're going to level up one way or the other. They're awaiting a debrief. Did they succeed? They didn't, but they gained experience nonetheless. They don't die. I can send them off on this mission here. Their chance of success is going to be based on the equipment they have, their traits and their abilities. And as you can see, the mission traits have different little aspects that will be affected by the abilities your strike team has. Now, we'll open up a couple of loot boxes right here. And this will give you a little bit of information on some of the loot issues that this game has. Because you're constantly collecting a lot of different things. A lot of them. This is the inventory. I currently have 38 items. If I go to research, we have all of these armor blueprints. I mean, for God's sake, I have 50 weapon blueprints at this point. Resources broken down into huge numbers of categories here. 16 types of minerals I'm currently holding on to. 4 tech materials, 5 biomaterials, 3 pieces of salvage, 5 augmentations, 2 special items, and a partridge in a pear tree. this is all bound into the resource and development system. Research and development. These are the two things that you can do here. Research is exactly what it sounds like. You can research various types of weapons and armor. There's a lot to offer here. It would be nice if there wasn't a slight delay in loading the images of them, but apparently they wanted fully renderable 3D models for everything, so that's probably why. Also, you'll probably notice a ton of wasted space here again, as you have to scroll down through this. This could... I mean, hell, if they just got rid of this bit in the middle, they could have easily listed this and had them broken down by category. It would have been very easy to navigate, but they chose style over substance. What's even more annoying about this is that it doesn't give you stats or anything like that. It just gives you lore. Now, the excuse for that is probably that there are 5 levels of each of these available. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's irrelevant. Currently, I have the Rasad Shotgun Level 2 researched. Surely it should show me the stats of that item right now, at a glance. But no, you have to go through another menu to find that information, as you can clearly see. Pretty damn irritating. And you also have to switch menus in order to find out the requirements of that. So I need Omnigel canisters, iron, nickel, element 0. You could have easily fit stats and requirements on the same screen. There's no need. I don't really understand why they would have that as an issue. There is a compare system, but not a good one. You, again, have to just keep hitting the same button to compare it to a bunch of different things. It compares it to what you've got equipped. Again, drop-down menus, this information at a glance, it's clunky, no doubt about it. Unnecessarily so. And it can be difficult to delve through all of this stuff. I would really like to know, at a glance, whether or not I should even be interested in the Angaran Gorilla set or the Ket Fusion set without diving in individually and looking at these different stats. All of this could have very easily been found on these menus. Now, the way that you get these points is through the occasional deliveries of them, but also through scanning. You may have heard that this game likes you to scan things. It does. You scan a lot of things. The scanner is used in the story. The scanner is used to solve puzzles. The scanner is used to mark quest objectives. The scanner is used to gather research data. And usually, if you're in proximity of a big research cache, it will blink a little G icon at the bottom of the screen and say, hey, go scan. Otherwise, you'll be scanning practically everything. And there's a huge amount of world building in that scanning as well. Amount of information that's almost obnoxious in how detailed it is, down to the chemical composition of a solar heater, for God's sake. Now, while I appreciate that commitment, I think most people are going to be more interested in simply gathering the research data from these things, in which case a scanning pulse would have been a better solution. Unfortunately, they elected not to do that. But it really is up to you. You're going to need a lot of research data if you want to max out some of these things. There are a lot of blueprints to work with and far more as you go through the game. So just bear that in mind. Now, there's one other thing about research which is a bit unusual, because for most of these things, it's just researching the ability to craft them. Well, with augmentations, that's a little bit different. Augmentations are components that can be integrated into the crafting process of any item that is rank 2 or higher. And these require research, and they give you a single copy of it, but they also then allow the augmentation to drop or be made available in stores later. So you can get more of them if you wish. An ultra rare one here, a beam emitter. This completely changes the nature of the weapon I put it in. It will turn it into an energy beam. And there are a lot of very interesting augments that give significant bonuses depending on what you put them into. If I get the cryo condenser and put it into a weapon, if I'm using cryo ammo, it doubles the effectiveness of it. If I put it into my legs, it lets me do a cryo blast on that jump melee slam, which is quite nice. A shield oscillator can restore shields on kill or restore shields on emptying a magazine. This customization is what makes the crafting system compelling, in my opinion, because you combine that with rank, different weapon variants, and, of course, mods that you can put into the thing after you've built it. You can even name the weapon if you wish. Let's have a look and see how that works. So this happens in development. Now, for some reason, development has no problem telling you what materials are required. Look at this. Materials required, right here, over this. Why is this not in research? Well, you might think it's not important. Well, it is, because I don't want to research something that I don't have the materials for. It would be nice to know what I require in order to build things, and for some reason it's not there. And yet there are 3 places to find it here. 3. There, and here. Incredible. I don't know. That's a level of redundancy beyond what I'm used to seeing. Now, in development, it allows you to build things, and if you have the materials, you can build it from this menu here. Admittedly, there is still a ton of scrolling done, and it is ordered by rank, not by any other particular way of sorting. You can't change that. I would maybe like to sort instead by type. As you can see, it's rank and alphabetical order. Be nice again to sort by that. You have to scroll down pretty far. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can build right here. If you want to break it down by type, you can go up here, which takes you to an entirely different configured menu that gives you the list here. And of course, a lot of this is grayed out because you don't know exactly what you need. Weirdly enough, this menu does not provide the extra information about what materials are required. You might say, well, that's easy. It's in the middle right here. Yeah, but I know what Fe means because I know my periodic table, but do you know what V means? Could you tell me that? Vanadium. In order to know what exactly the V is, I've got to go to a separate menu to find it. So like EZ, element 0, and so on and so forth. It's inconvenient. And because there are so many crafting materials required, remembering what you need to gather is a giant pain in the arse. Not to mention, exploring the galaxy to find it can be even worse. There are vendors scattered across planets that sell different things. There's a kiosk available in your Tempest, which is not integrated with this screen at all. So let's say, for instance, damn, I really want to make the Avenger Assault Rifle, but I'm a little bit short on iron. But I bet since it's a common material, the vendor probably sells it. I could probably just buy it from this menu. No. Oh, no. You have to go all the way out. Several escapes, all the way out. And 1 foot to the right. 1 foot to the right. These could have been integrated into the same screen. But they're not. And I'm going to scroll all the way down here. Let's see. Do they have any iron? Any old iron? Probably not, from what I can tell. Even though it is quite common. Now, if I want to instead look at materials, again, it changes the nature of the screen. Look at this. My items and vendor items. For instance, you might think, well, sorry, I escaped out of that. I might want to know, hey, that uranium looks tasty. I wonder how much uranium I have. Maybe I should buy some more. Does it tell you from this screen? No, it doesn't. If I want to find that out, I either have to go over here to my items, scroll. For the love of God, keep scrolling. For the love of God, help me. Find uranium. Or go to resources. Remember which of those it's in. I think it's minerals, probably. Head to vendor items. Still doesn't tell me. Go to my items over here. Scroll down. Again, scroll. Find uranium. Hey, there's how much I have. That is unbelievably inconvenient. That is far more steps than should ever be necessary to figure that out, especially when there are so many crafting items and materials available in this game. That should all be clearly available at a glance. If I wanted to buy uranium, as I hover over it, it should say, you already have 5 of this. But it doesn't. So many problems. So many issues with this. And it makes the crafting system way less enjoyable than it should be by any rights. If all of that was all built into the same area and this menu wasn't a pain in the ass to navigate and it was easy to tell exactly what you needed, where to get it from and all sorts of things like that without having to go through multiple menus and then traveling off into the galaxy remembering, is it vanadium, uranium, element 0 or carbiastium that I require to craft this helmet? Damned if I can bloody well remember. There's more aspects to that as well. It would be great to, again, be able to see at a glance if I'm going to develop something, what augments I already have access to from this menu. But I have to select, go here, no augments available, all that kind of thing. There's so many ways to organize this that would be far, far superior to what we're currently experiencing. And it's a shame because it's a good crafting system. It genuinely is. I'm trying to find something I have an augment available to actually craft. I can put electrical conduits into my Ket fusion chest and a power booster. So I'm going to craft this unique chest piece and I can name it as I want. And then, of course, if it has mod slots, then I can modify it even further with that. That's a degree of equipment customization, and to some extent, some people would argue the micromanagement of your stats and character, min-maxing, that they don't really like. But I do. I think that's great. And Mass Effect has not been focused on that over the last few games, and I'm glad to see it come back. But again, another example of that dodgy interface. Something that is, frankly, annoying, infuriating, and clunky to use, that indicates the overall design philosophy behind the UI was disorganized and didn't really make an awful lot of sense. There's even aspects such as the codex that could do with pass over here. There's a lot of information in the codex, and some of it isn't just lore either. The journey so far, I'm not going to select that because it's full of spoilers, but the codex is useful for finding out information about certain game mechanics. And it can sometimes be quite hard to find those things. Where's the search bar? Be great to be able to do that. There's so much in here. It gets to the point where I probably just want to download the app for iOS. Again, I've said the same thing about the journals. Quite similar. Difficult to find what you're looking for here. I'd like to know what my relationship status is with the various people on my team. I have to click through several menus to find that. And some of this doesn't even make sense. It's like Andromeda viability was tacked on here. Why is that not a button in this menu? Everything else is. And yet, down to the bottom here, I've got to hit V. It's a little box. It's like someone forgot to put it there, and then a couple of weeks before the game came out, it's like, damn it, we need to put a button in there. Well, we don't have time to completely redo the UI to incorporate it in a way that looks good and makes logical sense. Let's just slap it down the bottom where you'll never bloody notice. Sloppy. Very, very, very sloppy. No doubt about it.
If we're going to live here, someone has
Why do I need to go to a separate terminal for email? I mean, really now. You can do holographic video communication and all sorts of things like that while I'm out in the field, and yet if I want to have a video conference, I have to go to the video conference area, which is all the way up here, and if I want to read my email, I have to go all the way back over there, rather than just hitting escape and reading my email from there. Why do I have to go back to the bloody ship to do that? I don't know. Kind of designed to waste your time. Arguably an immersion element, saying, you know, we want you to explore your ship because it gives you excuses to talk to people and socialize. And yes, of course, that's key part of the Mass Effect experience. But what you're doing is using inconvenience to try and cajole me into doing those things, whereas you should be encouraging me through the carrot rather than the stick. Let's head out to another planet, because I want to, again, show you a little bit more variety as to what's going on. And we'll start to wrap up some conclusions, because I've tackled the majority of aspects of the game. I've talked about the mechanics, I've talked about the writing, again, a very nebulous concept. I've talked about character interaction, and I've said before that, you know, I think it's a mixed bag. I like the interaction with some characters, I dislike the interaction with others. And honestly, that was the case with Mass Effect and Dragon Age as well. It's a case of finding the characters that you enjoy, and there are some to enjoy. I like Vetra, I like Jarl, and I like Drask. I think they're great. I find PB irritating, but I'm sure some people will like that Damarsari raccoon. And I don't really find the two human companions compelling, but I certainly never found the human companions compelling in some of the Mass Effect games either. I didn't find Ashley all that interesting, or Caden, or anything along those lines. So, a mixed bag, as is the case with most BioWare games, really. You're not going to like everybody. And there are some cool interactions from time to time, and, of course, cutscenes that you'll never see if you don't take specific people down to specific planets. But I have to say, the experience of questing across those planets, exploring them with my team, have my team interact with various either quests or NPCs, and of course, this really awesome system by which you are encouraged to revisit planets you've already been to because the colonies that you establish there are progressing as you are while you're doing other things. You don't expect them to just sit around and do nothing. You can visit your colonies from time to time, they'll have brand new quests for you, and they'll have opened up new areas of the map. I don't know if you could ever really be done with this game. There's so much to do. And the way that they have created those quests and staged them and gated them is sensible. It makes logical sense. It ties into the overall storyline. And do not tell me that this world does not look goddamn gorgeous. Look at this thing. So yeah, this game doesn't look very good. Are you kidding me? It looks gorgeous. Look at this bloody place. There's a sense of wonder when it comes to this kind of thing. No doubt about it. And I've been in some places that have blown my mind in terms of environmental design and art. That all contributes to feeling like the game has a lot of content, which it does, and feeling like your story progress is tied into mechanical progress and the fact that they are doing things without you being there. They are getting on with it. And they're inviting you back there from time to time. It's like, hey, we've got a problem maybe only you can solve. Or, hey, you know, come and maybe help us out. We've got a few issues here and there. There are quite a few elements of that which I find compelling. But of course, there are without question some quests that I probably don't want to do. A lot of that stuff that's pretty optional. I don't have to if I don't want to. But I'd like to help that colony. You know, I built it. I was the one responsible for it. I feel a sense of ownership over that. So of course I want to help it out. You talk about story? That to me is good story. Making me feel as if what I did through the gameplay had a real impact on the story and making me invested in that area, so I'll want to go back and complete more quests there. Let's have a word with this fellow.
Ah, you'll be the Pathfinder then. Dr. McIntyre from the Nexus.
Ryder, welcome to Havarl.
She'll be more welcoming now that you put the back on track. The Angara invited us to monitor plant growth and study ruins out in the jungle. It's the chance of a lifetime.
Be careful around those monoliths. There might be more stasis fields. We think they only affect Angara, but who knows?
Oh, we know. Make no mistake. I have a check-in system ready. Whether young Farley remembers it when he's chasing butterflies is another matter.
What does your team do here?
Zera is our botanist. She'll be minding the plants and designing an artificial habitat for them. She also happens to be an engineer. Sorry, one profession's never enough. Then there's young Farley. He's here for the insects.
And you?
I'm the xenoanthropologist. A fancy word for talking to the Angara about those ruins. And listening.
Good luck, McIntyre.
Safe journeys, Ryder.
As I said, the majority of the conversations do not contain my face is tired level of dialogue. This area is a little smaller. There's a lot of exploration to be had, but you can't use the Nomad here. We could fast travel down into a large canyon if you like. The sense of scale is truly there. As we head here, you'll probably realize there are some minor loading times if you use fast travel. The loading times are generally not there when you walk. But yeah, look at the size of this. There's something about it that very much triggers my fantasies of exploring the galaxy, more so than the other Mass Effect games did, honestly, because that was more about fighting the big bad, and while there are certainly threats to deal with in this game, no doubt about that. I have a terrible shot. It's mostly the pellet spread on this thing. It's just a little too inaccurate at that kind of range. There's so much to explore here, and the establishment of colonies is, in my opinion, kind of a more relatable goal than dealing with these implacable, unstoppable biomechanical things or some giant evil villain. There are villains, of course, but I do enjoy this goal, which just makes you a hero, but in a more down-to-earth and grounded kind of way. You're not a superhero, but you are a leader. You're trying to lead your people to a better life. And I can dig that. And the way it's all tied into the game systems and the questing is done, in my opinion, in a very compelling way. And yes, honestly, that does allow me to endure, and I'm not going to say ignore, but endure the various dialogue issues, animation problems in the cutscenes, and some questionable character relations. Now, don't put the gun away. I want to hit it with a sword. Drive me closer. There's a lot to find. Big worlds to explore, some more intriguing than others. Some are war zones, some have been taken over by alien plant life. There's a big variety in terrain. And like I said, there's just this giant sense of scale that makes exploring these areas really quite enjoyable, even if there is far too much scanning going on from time to time. The jump jets also allow for some platforming segments. Usually I don't enjoy those, but they're few and far between, and frankly, they work pretty well. But one minor thing I'd like to say is that it would be nice if my rider could automatically mantle very small rocks. I don't see a reason for me to get stuck on those. Just add auto mantle into the game, will you? That would be something that I would very much appreciate. It would make traversal a little bit more enjoyable. Still far more so than Dragon Age Inquisition, and I find these areas much more compelling to explore and, of course, to quest within. There are many secrets to be found, ancient technologies and areas, some of which are flabbergasting in terms of their scale, beauty, and, in some cases, just alien unfamiliarity. Some of them are plain weird, but, man, look at the size of that. So, do I have a conclusion for you after all of this time? I think I do. This is a very flawed game. This is a game that lacks polish. This is a game that was probably rushed. Most things I think could be fixed through patching, but it's not my job to tell you what could be. It's my job to tell you what is. And as it stands, yes, the game has plenty of problems. Animations in cutscenes are not very good. Lip syncing is poor. Ryder in particular, I wouldn't even necessarily say crosses the uncanny valley. She just doesn't look human. The male rider actually looks more human, and the animations in the face are better than the female rider. There are some presets that look better than others. The general character customization in terms of the visual aspects of your character is not very strong. And some of that dialogue isn't very good either. I think the tone is what weirds me out more than anything. I just would like to see a lot of it be a little bit more grim and desperate than it is. I find it difficult to be purely evil with Ryder, purely mean with Ryder. Even my, I suppose, strict answers and less emotional answers, it's very hard to be straight up mean to people. Honestly, you do get the very occasional prompt to interrupt a conversation, but it's few and far between. I can remember maybe 4 over 25 hours of play. So not really an awful lot going on with that, is there? No, not so much. So it would be nice if I could define my character a little better. There are things that the game does remember. If you are very sarcastic, it can actually be noted, and it can affect your relationships with certain characters. And it can even affect the VO lines that are used. There are variants of certain VO lines. Gravity well, not a bug, maybe. Who knows? And they change dependent on how many of a certain kind of response that you've used in the past. If you're a very sarcastic person, then sarcasm will color even your more serious responses at times later on in the game, which is a crazy system. I believe Dragon Age 2 had aspects of that in as well. But of course it means that because you have so much VO, some of it's going to be inconsistent, and some conversations are not going to sound as natural with certain responses versus others. It's what happens when you treat a conversation as something that you can just mix and match. You can't. That's not how real conversations actually work. But, despite all of that, it has a strong combat system, an awesome crafting system that is marred by a UI designed by Andromeda aliens, as far as I'm concerned, not very usable whatsoever, that could use a lot of improvement, some tedious gathering, no doubt about that. You can bypass quite a lot of that by just buying things, of course, but I like to craft custom weapons with augments. Why would I not? I mean, this pistol, for instance, has these homing plasma charges as a result of an augment. They're slow-moving, but they home in on targets. I've made a completely different weapon. I have a shotgun that I turned into a grenade launcher, for God's sake. So much customization in my equipment. Far more than any previous Mass Effect game. Combine that with the progression, the variety of skills, and the strength of the combat, and what you are doing on a regular basis is, in my opinion, very enjoyable. That core gameplay loop. There's a lot of fighting in it. There's been a lot of fighting in quite a few Mass Effect games, no doubt. It's hard to criticize that. I think it may very well be one of the best in the series. But if you are more interested in well-written dialogue, if you're more interested in interesting NPCs, they exist, but they're maybe few and far between. Some of them are obnoxious, no doubt. Some of them are interesting, some not so much. It's going to be very subjective, of course. Some people are going to find certain enemies and certain NPCs more compelling than others. But to me, that's not what really gets me about the story. It's that overarching goal and the way that every quest and everything I do and every conversation I have and every decision I make all ties into that overall goal of making Andromeda habitable for human Asari, Turian, Solarian, and the other guys' life. That's a compelling and motivating goal. And the fact that it rewards you in the game for doing that, very smart. A smart melding of non-interactive storytelling with emergent storytelling, and of course, the natural progression of your character in terms of gear and effectiveness. Not many games manage to marry those things together in a way that's elegant. And even if the Andromeda point system is gamey, no doubt about that, and even if it's a rather contrived way to quantify all of the things that you're doing, it does work. And it does give meaning to pretty much everything that you do. And that's what I care about when it comes to story. That those quests that I'm doing, those things that I'm gathering, those people that I'm helping, they're all contributing to the whole. They're all progressing my story as a pathfinder. They're making me better, they're making the galaxy better. A lot of people have said that this is the worst Mass Effect game in the series. I don't agree. But there are definitely aspects of it that are weaker than other parts of the series, no doubt about that. But it's going to depend on your priorities and what you personally enjoy. The fact that I couldn't even say with certainty that the combat system is better than previous Mass Effect games indicates just how divisive a game like this can be. I think it's better, but I realize that my priorities are not the same as everybody else's, and the reasons that some people have given for saying that it isn't better, that it's actually worse, are entirely valid. Yeah, you're totally right. The squad mate control is limited to say the least. Not being able to control their abilities and having even less customization for your squad mates is a problem for some people. Not for me, but for others. They've fundamentally changed the nature of that Mass Effect combat, but they got rid of things that I didn't enjoy, like that focus on cover and the slower overall nature of it. Oh, damn cloaking device bastards. It's not a perfect game. It's a very imperfect game. The state of polish in this game is not excusable. Whether or not it means that this game is a deal breaker for you, or whether it's a flawed game that still has a great deal to enjoy in it, well, that's going to be down to you, frankly. I err on the side of saying that despite its problems, despite no doubt a slow start, and it does have a slow start, slower perhaps than other Mass Effect games, although maybe not so much compared to other BioWare titles, no doubt. Regardless of that, I was willing to persevere. There have been slower areas of the game that I haven't enjoyed as much as others, but overall the pacing has been surprisingly good. I haven't encountered the Hinterlands problem. Remember that I said I'd played about 55 hours of Dragon Age Inquisition and then still didn't really feel qualified to give a first impression? And that's simply because that game was so open and there was so much padding. While there are quests like that here, no doubt, the way that they've paced them is sensible and makes sense. Putting a lot of those MMO-like quests as optional things that unlock once you have established the outpost and focusing on the act of establishing that outpost and the story of doing so and the trials and tribulations associated with it is sensible. It's smart. Great context given, even to quests that if you stripped everything away would otherwise be collect 10 bear asses, and really there aren't all that many of those either. I think they deserve props for that. And to me, that has made the game enjoyable and, for the most part, compelling, with the occasional exception. I'm not the kind of person to give scores. I don't like them. I feel encouraging people to judge such a massive product as this, you know, the fruits of years' worth of labor from hundreds of people. A game that cost tens of millions of dollars to develop, and boiling it all down to an arbitrary number that really seems to vary from outlet to outlet is a disservice. It doesn't encourage good dialogue. People obsess over this imaginary number. But, all of that considered, if there ever was a 7 out of 10 game, I think Mass Effect Andromeda is that. A true 7 out of 10, not, oh, it's under 90%, therefore it's not worth buying ever. 7 out of 10, to me, means good, but flawed. Flawed in many ways. Like, every single system in the game has a flaw with it. Some are minor, some not so much. There are lots of little parts of this game that annoy me. There are lots of little parts of this game that bother me and take me out of the experience. Dialogue, animations, UI, all sorts of things like that. But if I think about my whole experience so far, if I think about the last 25 hours of play, and I think whether or not I want to continue purely for my own personal enjoyment, then the answer to that is an unequivocal yes, yes I do. It's entirely possible that things go to hell later, but like I said, I'm not so bothered about the ending of a game. I rarely ever see the ending of a game. I play far too many of them for that. I'm not really bothered about how compelling the writing of the story is. I care about the journey, not the destination. There's the best way to describe it. And this game has a hell of a journey going for it. And I feel compelled to continue that journey. If it ends up in a rubbish place at the end of it, that's probably not going to color my opinion of the game all that much. Because the chances are that the journey there was a good experience. It might leave a sour taste in my mouth, but that's just the aftertaste, and that quickly passes. The meal is what matters. And the meal is a good one. But definitely not a perfect one, and a very, very flawed one. Cooked by a chef that has aspirations, no doubt, but lacks experience. Maybe all the talent is there, but the technique isn't. Mass Effect Andromeda, ladies and gentlemen. Currently available on Origin for $60 or your regional equivalent. Also available on PlayStation 3 and Xbox One. My multiplayer coverage is a separate video. I'll link that in the description below. If you got to the end of this, then well done. That's, I believe, my longest WTF is ever, but how could it not be? With so much kerfuffle over this game over the last few weeks, how could it not be? God damn, that's gorgeous. Thank you for watching, folks. If you enjoyed the video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. I'll see you next time.